I'll just quickly introduce, of course, he doesn't need much introduction, but I'll put in a few words about Professor Steenkamp. Professor Steenkamp is a prolific author, and he has written 5 books for practitioners, including his current book. This is the time to lead lessons for today's leaders from bold decisions that changed history. Earlier books include Retail Disruptors, The Spectacular Rise and Impact of the Hard Discounters, Global Brand Strategy, Worldwide Marketing in the Age of Branding, Brand Breakout, How Emerging Market Brands Will Go Global, and so on, and many others. Professor Steenkamp has also taught, consulted, and given executive seminars on all continents. His work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times, New York Times, among many others. Of course, Professor, we've had the great honor of having you in one of our earlier programs, and thank you again for joining us here today. So without further ado, I'd hand it over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, for your kind words. It is wonderful to be participating in this conference of the CII. At the previous time, I was in Kolkata, and it was a great event. I think in this medium we can reach more people, but I still believe that meeting people personally is a wonderful experience as well. But we are currently in a crisis, in a fairly unprecedented crisis, as we all know. A global crisis is COVID, but then we have also regional crises, if you will, like increased racial tension in the United States, in India, increased tension with China that has emerged in this year. And then there are other problems in other parts of the world. But let's say the one thing that ties us together in a very unfortunate way is the COVID crisis that rolled over the world in this year, and it has had a tremendous effect. It is the biggest turn down in history since the Second World War. So global economic output at the end of 2020 is going to be 8% lower than it would have otherwise been. And as we see in this graph, we see a deep decline in emerging markets, Latin America, the Eurozone area, less of a decline in the United States and China, but they're still very serious. Now, looking at the emerging markets, we see some really troubling things. Is that it will be the first decline in economic output in emerging markets in 60 years, and 89 million people will be pushed into really dire poverty, which is, of course, a human tragedy. And the final issue is debt is soaring around the world in different countries. It is soaring especially to high levels in developed economies. But the thing here is that in emerging markets, debt is also soaring. And there it is even more of a problem because emerging markets often have to borrow in say, developed market currencies, whereas the extreme case is the United States, where the Fed can essentially just print more money and finance a deficit in that way. So all in all, we see really a serious crisis, and there is really at this point not an end in sight. India is unfortunately not immune either. We see here the second quarter of in GDP decline, and that was the quarter that COVID actually hit the rest of the world most. So in China, it was the first quarter that was worst. In India and others, it is the second quarter. And when you look at it, India's decline has been very significant, deeper than any other major economy. Now, that doesn't mean that there cannot be some improvement again, but what we see currently, my friends, is that a second wave of corona is rolling over Europe. It is starting to emerge also in the United States. And if that would also happen in other parts of the world, and there is no reason why that would that absolutely not be the case, that is, we are not out of the woods yet, unfortunately. Now, of course, companies know that. Obviously, they're not living on the moon. And what is the dominant reaction for companies if the economy turns sour? The dominant reaction is to cut discretionary expenses, especially discretionary marketing expenses. And me and my colleagues have documented that in many different countries with a slew of research. Advertising, research and development / new product introductions are significantly cut in recessions, but we also see that effect in other elements of the marketing, like market research and distribution. So what we see is that in bad times, expenses are cut. Marketing expenses, which often are discretionary or at least perceived to be discretionary, are among the worst that are going to be cut. So I'm going to go into that a little bit in more detail. And there I will focus on the two where the most evidence is available. That is advertising and R&D. Here we see global advertising investment from 2007 to 2020, 2021. And we see that first in the global financial crisis, advertising dipped dramatically. Then there was a recovery period, and in 2020 it is increasing again very substantially. Expectations is that it's going to grow again in 2021, but those expectations do not factor in a possible second COVID wave. So that is kind of uncertain, but it is certain that advertising in this year is going to be cut very much. Now that is understandable. You have to cut costs, but actually, it's not necessarily wise. So research that I've conducted among a number of large companies, in this case, is that companies that adopt a long-term advertising strategy in which they do not cut advertising in bad times. So essentially, they have a long-term strategy for advertising and not let it vary too much about up and down with the business cycle. They have a growth rate in stock price that is 1.3 percentage points higher than firms that cut advertising in recessions. So actually, that's a pretty big effect, because 1.3 percentage points over a period of a number of years, because we calculate that over a longer period, we are talking about quite a significant effect. It's advertising. In R&D, the same picture. These are US data. But what you see, these vertical bars are, recessions in the US, and we see that every time there is a recession, that R&D is being cut. So that is, and recent work that I've done documents the same thing when it comes to expenditure on distribution and when it comes to expenditure on market research. But the general picture should be clear right now. Now then the question is, okay, cutting in bad times may make a lot of sense, but is that a smart strategy? And then what you have to do, working with companies is, okay, what is the effectiveness of advertising and R&D in good times versus bad times? And I've studied this issue, based on data of numerous companies in a number of articles, which I'm not going to discuss here, but I will be highlighting some elements of insights which are very robust. Just that sets the stage to what should you do in tough times, and why is that not done, and what should be done differently. So for that, I will highlight results of work that I've done in about 1,200 B2B and B2C firms. Those are US firms, but as I told you, I've done a lot of other work also that is consistent with this, but I'm not going to review all of that. Let's just look at advertising and R&D in good times. Now, what we find here is that firms that increase R&D and advertising in good times, they see a market share increase of 0.83 percentage points. Whereas if they decrease it in good times relative to their competitors, you see a decrease of 54 percentage points. Essentially, that means that putting a lot of weight behind advertising and R&D in good times versus not doing that builds market share. Essentially, what that is what most marketers would believe. R&D and advertising investments, they help you to grab more customers. Now, that is normal, if you will, although some people even, would question that, especially some of the financial people. But how is that picture different when we are looking in bad times? Actually, there what we get is a double whammy. Those are the blue bars. So simply speaking, if I put more behind advertising and R&D in economic bad times, my market share grows even more than when I do it in good times. The reason is there that because people are essentially getting concerned, they may be more prone to leave your brand because of economic uncertainty. You need giving them more of a reason to do that, to stick with you. And a lot of people, the dominant reaction is not doing that. So if you do it, and most firms don't do it, that is just the overwhelming number of firms don't do it, you stand out more and you gain more market share. Whereas the opposite side is when you would decrease R&D and advertising. So what you see here is, if you follow a strategy of investing in R&D and advertising in bad times, it generates 1.79 percentage point market share versus in good times 1.36% market share. Essentially, what it says is R&D and advertising are about 25% more effective in bad times than they are in good times. And that is an interesting point, but that is market share. And especially the financial people of in your company might wonder, of course, market share is important, but what about profits? There actually, let's first again look at good times. It shows clearly that advertising and R&D build profits. Firms that invest in advertising and R&D in good times, they see their profits increase on average about $8.6 million. The absolute amounts, because we have looked at a huge swath of companies from smaller companies to bigger companies. Whereas if you decrease it, so you have less expenses, but actually your profits decline, which means that advertising and R&D do not only pay for themselves, they also generate profits, which of course is what you would want. So this is the scenario. In good times, you should invest in advertising and R&D. Now again then, how is that picture different in bad times? There actually what you find is that the profit difference is even bigger. Being courageous in bad times versus going with the flow and cutting it like everybody else is doing it generates $18 million of additional profits versus 14 million in good times, which is an increase of, a little below 25%. That is profits. That is real money. Now, it's still courageous because advertising and especially R&D investments do not show up in their positive outcome in terms of profit at the very year that you do it. You take a hit, especially when it comes to R&D. My research has found that you do take a hit, that it reduces profits in that year, but in the subsequent years, you much more than claw those costs back in additional profits. So that means that this is the effect, not only what you get in the year that you do it, but also in the years 1, 2, and 3 after that. So that means that to have this view, you need to have more of a long-term view, understanding that advertising and even more R&D are investments that pay off over a number of years. Now, let me just tell you one thing here is that, I'm an academic, so you may say, this is just abstract theory, this may not apply. This is real data. This is real data, profit data, market share data, R&D, advertising data, etc. I have studied that phenomena in different countries over a large period of years. So it isn't just one particular, kind of snapshot that kind of fits my story. And that makes it especially pertinent. This is not what firms say they do or something like that. These are all kind of officially documented findings. Now, the question then is why, if actually the evidence is strong that investing in R&D and advertising and also the other ones, essentially investing in marketing, in brand building in bad times is a good strategy, but on the other hand, most firms don't do that. Why is that the case? And one set of reasons is what I call financial myopia, short-sightedness, financial short-sightedness. That is that firms usually view marketing as an expense rather than an investment. An expense is something that, okay, is done and the results show up in that same year. I show in my work very clearly that that is not the case. That is the effect of advertising shows up in that year and the next year, and the effect of R&D shows up even in 3 years thereafter. So that means that those are investments that generate cash flow over years. It should be an investment rather than an expense. Another reason is that many firms have a misguided way of setting marketing budgets as a percentage of sales. That's actually very common. But the point is, in a recession, sales are going down. So even if you keep the same percentage of sales, that means that you have to cut that. So that doesn't help. That budget rule means that automatically the moment sales go down, you are cutting your investments in marketing. And the third aspect is that there is too much in companies a view on short-term financial results as opposed to investment in long-term brand equity. So the financial myopia I have to do is that there is too much of a focus on the short term as opposed to the long term. Now, I would say that those financial myopia, they are serious, but they are more an illustration of something much more serious. And that is, to me, what really is crucial, is that many companies exhibit a lack of courage in their leadership, because these financial myopia can be addressed. But more important is, why is that often not done? Because it requires the company leadership to stand up against pressure from the financial markets. It's one of the reasons why privately held companies are in a better position to essentially think in the long term than publicly held, because they have less pressure from the financial markets, although they may still have some pressure from the banks, of course. And there is this other aspect about herding behavior. It's very interesting, and it's very common. The argument that you hear is that, well, I am cutting, everybody is cutting it. So, I can't be wrong if I'm doing what everybody else is doing. Well, the point is, and here this cartoon kind of shows it, if everybody else does the wrong thing, okay, why should you do the wrong thing? I mean, leadership is not forged by doing what everybody else is doing. Leadership is forged by doing what you believe is actually the most effective for what you want to achieve. And for that, I think what we need to look at is we need to look at more carefully at this leadership angle. And so my study, on the one hand, of marketing behavior in recessions, and on the other hand, my study of leadership, which I have been interested in because of a lot of leadership positions I've held, but also because I see that so much of the issues in companies are due to leadership as opposed to anything else, is that I believe what is needed more is courageous leadership. Leadership that is willing to go against the flow. And the flow is, let's say, the herding behavior that we saw in the cartoon before. That is, okay, everybody else cuts, we are going to cut as well. We are going to essentially make sure the short term is guarded, which makes some sense. But the point is, if you think about that, you have already made the mistake of not planning for the long term. So my study of leadership, and of course, because of time constraints, I cannot go into all the nuances or all the factors. I will draw out some of the key factors. My study of leadership, looking at a number of historically examples of great leadership, says that for courageous leadership, one thing that is really necessary is a mindset that is focused on change, purposeful change. Because courage requires something that is not the norm in society, in companies. That is that you're going to change. You are going to go into a different direction. How can you nurture that? One of the ways to do that, they're not mutually inconsistent, by the way, is that challenge, analyze, learn. So, for example, let me just be a little bit self-serving. The people that are currently attending this great conference of CII, they learn a lot of new things. They could also have spent their time doing other things. No, but they take a little bit of time off to learn some new things. For example, learning about what most companies do in recessions versus what actually would be the smart behavior, what I'm talking about now. And so they kind of analyze it. They may challenge what I'm saying, or they may also challenge actually then what people in their own company are saying and doing. Another part of such a purposeful mindset is that that you can experiment with alternative solutions. Now, if you don't, for example, you have enough money to keep investments in everything, then you may want to experiment if you need to be with cutting back some more on advertising or doing more on R&D or perhaps something else, trying to tweak the advertising mix a little bit, and you may run a little bit of experiment with you. You could do for one brand, you could do this, and for another brand, you could do it, so that you really understand better what you should do in a recession, because we have now a recession, but it's not going to be the last recession, and we don't know how long this recession will last, by the way, and when the next recession will come. A second aspect is to develop for yourself a bold strategic vision, and that is, as leader, one of the things that I've identified in my work is that all the great leaders that really had major effects, they actually had a clear vision about what they wanted to achieve in their lives, what they wanted to achieve in their career, what they wanted to achieve in their company. So they had a clear vision. What were their goals? A second aspect for a bold strategic vision is it doesn't only have to be clear for yourself, and then you have to communicate to others and get input from others how to do that. An aspect of a bold vision is you need to prioritize the long run over the short run. There is no way about that. If you prioritize the short run over the long run, essentially you are doing what most other people are doing, and it is a truth. What most other managers are doing is just not the smartest strategy. But there is another point also. You need to have a high tolerance of uncertainty, because the short run is fairly certain. The long run is not, meaning that if you cut expenses in the short run, it is kind of certain what you will get. Your bottom line will be protected. Now, the benefits of not doing that, of continuing to invest in your brands, play out in the longer run, in the next year, in 2 years, perhaps in 3 years after you do it. Now, that's less certain. So these benefits are less certain because they play out in the longer term than these things that you get by going with the flow in the short term, which means that you have to have a high tolerance for uncertainty. But courageous leadership requires that you take risks. They don't have to take idiotic risks. They can be calculated risks. So for that, it is important that you challenge, that you analyze, that you learn. But risk-taking is part of the equation. And that is something that is just highly important to keep in mind. If you are a person that is by nature very cautious, then you might struggle with some of these issues. A third component is execution of your vision. There is a lot of issues here, but I'm going to just pick out two. First, if you go against received wisdom, and I mean, I don't think it is wisdom at all, but at least received practice of essentially in a crisis, you do something else than everybody else is doing, you will get a lot of resistance from within the company and from outside of the company, from the financial markets or some other key players out there. It then helps to build what I call a networks of the willing, or a guiding coalition, as it has also been called. Those are people that are with you. For example, as a CEO, it is important that you get the board to agree with that you get some financial analysts, influential people on board, that they believe in your vision. So essentially what you need to do is to build within your organization and outside a number of people that buy into your ideas, so that you don't have to do it all by yourself. And the final element that I want to know is that all the leaders that I've studied that are real impactful, because I mean, a leader cannot be impactful at all. The real impactful leaders, they have grit. That is a one common thing. Some of them that I studied were intelligent, other not particularly. Some were great speakers, other ones not so much. Some were highly sociable, and others were actually not so highly sociable. Some were highly educated, some not particularly. But what they all had in common is they had grit. Grit has four components: focus, self-confidence, motivation to succeed, and resilience. So those are elements that you can nurture, and I can give you a long theoretical discussion what grit is, or you can I don't have time to play it, just YouTube Billy Ocean's hit song, when the going get tough, the tough get going. Essentially, when you look at that song and the lyrics, that's essentially grit. Now, what I have done is I have studied these elements in a large number of people that really changed the course of events. Very impactful people, and I distill those lessons and I show these applications, which, given time, only have about 30 minutes. I don't have time to go into that in this presentation, but they are derived from this particular, from a number of case studies where this kind of leadership was really put in practice. Takeaways. Overwhelming reaction of companies in a recession like the current crisis is to cut back on marketing and branding investments. But academic evidence is very clear, unambiguous, but using real data, that not doing that actually leads to considerably better outcomes than doing that. So essentially, the overwhelming reaction is not the reaction that is actually the one that you should do. The main reason for this overwhelming reaction and not actually doing what is smart is, in my view, is a lack of courageous leadership, of being willing to stand up against prevailing behavior. And this is just a very logical conclusion based on the fact that people do not do what actually is clearly most advantageous for the company to do. Now, so how can you, as a leader, say, okay, I may perhaps want to use that insight and perhaps see whether I can go against the flow. It's essentially whether I can exhibit leadership in a different kind. We all learn about leadership by observing others and by reading about leaders. That's the reason why leadership books, tend to be fairly popular. And we can learn actually a whole lot of past historical leaders. That's how many leaders actually learn what other people have done in the past. And many of the most impactful leaders can be found in areas, like politics, like religion, military, and other kind of fields, and how they can kind of inspire us. Now, if you are interested and you want to learn a lot more about courageous leadership, I may kindly refer you to my book, which is just come out. It is available on Amazon India. The hard copy and the Kindle version is a lot cheaper, so maybe more attractive for some of you. And why would we care about learning as business people from these historical leaders? Let me quote what The Economist wrote. Those historical figures, the kind of people that are described in my book, who have passed through the fire, surely have something to teach modern day managers. In the book, what you will find is 16 leaders taken from different geographies, from different time periods, different race, different gender, but different challenges that we're facing, very different challenges from civil rights to political challenges to religious challenges and a lot of other things. But what they all have in common is they did not go with the flow. They took courageous action, and in this way, they did change the course of world history, and the lessons of those leaders are relevant for us here and today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Steenkamp. It was a very enlightening session. We have received many, many questions. I'll only, share a few with you due to the lack of time.
Yes.
So this gentleman writes that, I've read the book that you've written, and it's a fascinating insight into the historical cases of leadership and how they've helped, people tide through difficult times. In your understanding, how is the COVID-induced downturn different from the Great Depression? And how do you feel that leaders can make companies more resilient to future black swan events?
Okay. I think the COVID depression is different from the Great Depression, that it is much less serious. Because the Great Depression was a systemic failure in the economy, like the Great Financial Crisis. The COVID-induced depression is serious in itself, but it is clearly related to COVID. And the moment that there would be a vaccine available, which hopefully will come fairly soon, and most people say it will be there next year, the general expectation is that the economy will come back. That doesn't mean that it is not serious and there will not be some damage because some economic activity will be lost. But so to me, the economic depression of the 1930s is a total different level of seriousness because it is systemic. How can firms, so the second question, how can firms guard themselves?
Yeah, so the second part was how can firms or leaders make companies more resilient to future black swan events?
Okay, perfect. And I would say one of the things is, and I've discussed that with a lot of companies, is that firms should reserve more money in good times for bad times. Let's say, honestly, I guess also in India, the squirrel is living. The squirrel is a small animal that in the fall hoards a lot of food for the upcoming winter. Now, the point is here is, and in America, you have, for example, an airline called Delta Airlines. Now, of course, airlines is a terrible situation, but Delta Airlines had reserved so much money in good times that, yes, it is challenging, but they're in much better shape than in American, for example, which had distributed all the money, given it away. And so they have a weak thing. So a very simple thing is, I would say two things. First is reserve more money, because bad times are coming again. We don't know when, but they will come again. And a second thing is prepare for these bad times, develop strategies for the bad times, including the ones that I'm talking about, is be prepared when everybody else hasn't done the scroll kind of thing, that you move ahead and essentially grab market share from the others. So prepare, reserve money, and prepare strategies, what you're going to do in bad times. And I can assure you one thing, after the next crisis, you will be in a much better shape than your competitor.
Well, that's good news. I hope people heed your advice. Professor, another question. As the CEO of a leading hospitality chain, I've had to take difficult decisions in laying off many staff. How can I try to build a network of the willing, as you put it, especially with a demotivated workforce?
Now, let's face it, the moment that you're laying off staff, there is going to be an issue here. But what you can do is, so it is challenging, but what you can do is the following, that you tell the staff that is being laid off. So first, you can do two things. First is the staff that you lay off, you make a commitment to them that you believe that the situation will rectify in the foreseeable future, which I think is a reasonable point that most people agree with, and that they will be hired back. You could even, if there is any money available, say that you would still provide some low level of benefit to them, or pay for the health insurance or something like, to the extent that that is possible. But essentially give the people that you lay off a hope that this is going to be temporarily. For the people that you retain, fortunately, but they will still be discouraged, because they will be afraid. They see their colleague being laid off. Say, explain to them also the situation, explain that you're going to rehire those other people, that currently is going to be a tougher time, but that you as hospital will let the people share in some of the good things, after things go back to normal. And the third thing I would definitely do is, and that you don't see in America, is as hospital leaders, you take the example and say, okay, I am going to take a pay cut of 50%. Or perhaps I'm not going to get any money, or something like that. I leave that up to you. But the point is, Jay, is what you see in America a lot is that companies are laying off people, and the boss gets an additional number of share options, raking in tons of money. Now, nothing is as discouraging as people being laid off and the boss feathering his own bed. And you could say that theory. No, actually, I've written posts on that on LinkedIn. It's really happening, and it is just a shame.
So essentially what you're saying is leading by example. That's fascinating.
Yes, you have to lead by example, and the people experiencing the pain, and they have to see that you share in their pain, not only in smooth words, because in India it's like the US or in Europe, smooth words is like a politician might be saying it is good, but you have to follow the trail of the money. Are you really willing to take your hit as a leader?
Good point. Professor, the next business question, obviously, this is in line with what you said. You've given a lot of fascinating research on how investing money in ad spends and R&D during difficult times is actually beneficial to business in the long term. However, as a business leader, I feel that conserving cash is more prudent rather than investing in an uncertain crisis, which is what we are in. What would be your one biggest advice to me to change my mind?
I would strongly recommend that person to take a little bit of time to read some of the evidence that what he is currently doing is, as I've been very open about, it is actually, it is the safer strategy, but it is not the more wise or courageous strategy. So what the leaders that I've studied, a number of those leaders, interestingly, they were actually voracious leaders of some insight, some in their particular field. So they were continuously learning, analyzing, as I also mentioned, and I would invite that leader to read some of that stuff. Send me a message on LinkedIn, and I'm gonna send him a few articles. Skip all the math, just show, okay, this is not a professor talking in an academic tower. But that is real data. It is. I think actually there is not an example, whether it is in leadership taking a pay cut or seeing it laid out. It is very. I think it is very important to do that. I think you're muted.
Professor, given the the paucity of time, I'll come to one last question.
Okay.
So this comes from the middle rung of management, and you mentioned the aspect of financial myopia, and
Yeah.
where the leadership doesn't see the direct benefits of investing in difficult times. So, as a vice president level employee, how can I actually convince the top deck of actually investing during these difficult times?
It's my experience, because when I'm working with companies, I sometimes work with marketing people, but sometimes I ask the CFO to come also to join. Let's put it from my experience, is that the CFO or the CEO probably too, actually, is more convinced by hard figures than by perhaps mushy talk. And that means that for the CEO and the CFO to see actually hard evidence, what has been shown, like in these articles, you might know others, but you may have the hard evidence, but you may not have it. But to show actually this is hard evidence, this is very consistent. This we find in a lot of different companies and industries, etc. That helps, because the most common complaint that I get from CFOs about the CMO or brand managers is that their talk is, in their view, mushy. We are talking about greater brand awareness and brand attachment, and honestly, I believe those are relevant, but the CMO doesn't get that stuff. Let me just have you one small thing to give in time. Is at one time when I was working with big company, was having a lot of issues. But had very strong brands. And I had a sidebar talk with the CFO, and he asked to me, Jan Benedict, I know the marketing people all the time talking a lot about that investing in a brand is important. And I said, I get it, because we have brands, but can you explain actually what it does to the company? I said to him, well, Bob, I think the simplest is as follows. The value of a company is the discounted cash flow, the sum of the discounted cash flows. Now, those cash flows, they come from the brands, because you are a branded company selling brands. Yeah, of course, that he says it agrees. Now, I said, if you have a strong brand, that means that people are more loyal to your brand and less susceptible to competitive actions. That means that your cash flow is less volatile over the years. Financial markets benefit less volatility by applying a lower discount rate to future earnings, ergo higher firm value. He said to me, oh, Benedict, now I finally understand it. Because that was the language in which he thought. I could also have talked mushy about brand association and people feeling good about it, etc. And that is still all very true. The point is only that it is like talking to the Holy Father in Rome, about the Quran. You're just on two different planes. You just don't understand each other. And so therefore, marketing people need to speak a little bit more the finance language and having hard data. And some of the things that I'm talking about, everything that I've been talking about is based on hard data.
I think there's no better note in which to conclude the first day of this summit. The marketing people need to be more courageous. Leadership needs to be more courageous on the whole and make bold decisions. Professor Steenkamp, it's been an amazing pleasure having you. And, we look forward to a future time when you can again join us here in India. Thank you very much.
It was an honor and a pleasure. And I do hope next time that I can again come to your wonderful country. I was there end of last year in Calcutta, not for you, but for another event. And it is a fascinating country, and the virtual connection doesn't do justice to the greatness of your country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Please take care. Yeah.
Bye.